story is about Esther May, an elderly black woman who was freed after 30 years of slavery and finally returns to the home she never stopped dreaming about. But when she steps inside, the person she finds there changes everything. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. She walked out of that cotton field carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper and a name she hadn't spoken in 30 years. Esther May Whitfield was 62 years old when freedom finally found her, and the first thing she did was fall to her knees and weep. Not from joy, not from relief, from the weight of everything she had lost and the terrifying question of what might be left. Because 30 years is not just time. 30 years is a lifetime. 30 years is children growing up without you, a husband growing old without you, a home becoming a memory so faded you can barely remember if it was ever real at all. And when Esther May stood up from that Georgia dirt on April 14, 1865, 5 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, she had only one thought in her mind: home. She was going home. What she found when she got there would change everything she believed about family, about loyalty, about the depths of human betrayal. But that part of the story comes later. First, you need to understand how Esther May Whitfield ended up in that cotton field in the first place. The year was 1835. Andrew Jackson was President of the United States. The Trail of Tears was forcing Cherokee people from their ancestral lands. And in a small town called Ridgewood, about 40 miles north of Savannah, Georgia, a free black community was thriving against all odds. They called it Freeman's Settlement, though it never appeared on any official map. About 200 people lived there, free people of color who had either been born free, purchased their freedom, or been manumitted by their former owners. Esther May was born there in 1803 to parents who had worked for 17 years to buy themselves out of bondage. Her father, Solomon Whitfield, was a blacksmith. Her mother, Ruth, took in laundry from white families in the surrounding towns. They were not wealthy, but they were free, and in that time and place, freedom was worth more than gold. Esther May grew up knowing the value of that freedom. She learned to read from a traveling preacher who passed through Freeman's Settlement when she was 7. She learned to write from her mother, who had taught herself in secret during her years in bondage. By the time she was 16, Esther May was the most educated woman in the settlement. She kept records for the community, wrote letters for those who could not write themselves, and dreamed of opening a school someday. In 1825, when she was 22, she married a man named Thomas Greer. He was a carpenter, skilled and steady, with hands that could turn rough wood into beautiful furniture. They built a small house on the edge of Freeman's Settlement, 2 rooms with a porch and a garden out back. Esther May planted roses along the fence, pink ones that reminded her of the flowers her mother had grown. They had 2 children, a daughter named Pearl in 1827 and a son named Isaiah in 1830. Life was hard, but it was good. Esther May thought she understood what happiness meant. Then came the night of September 3rd, 1835. Esther May was 32 years old. Pearl was 8. Then came the night of September 3rd, 1835. Esther May was 32 years old. Pearl was 8. Isaiah was 5. Thomas had gone to Savannah to deliver a set of chairs to a wealthy merchant. A trip that should have taken 3 days. He was due back the following morning. Esther May put the children to bed, checked the doors twice, and settled into her chair by the fire to wait. She never heard them coming. The first she knew of it was the crash of her front door being kicked open and the shouts of men's voices filling her home. There were 4 of them, white men with torches and rope, their faces twisted with a hatred she had never seen directed at her before. She tried to fight, she screamed, she clawed, she threw herself between the men and her children. But she was one woman against four, and they had no intention of being stopped. They dragged her out of her house. They dragged Pearl and Isaiah out behind her. And as Esther May watched, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but scream, they set fire to her home. The roses burned with everything else. What happened next was part of a practice that history would later call kidnapping into slavery. Free black people, especially those without powerful white allies, were vulnerable targets. Slave catchers would forge documents claiming their victims were runaway slaves. Local authorities, often complicit or simply indifferent, would not investigate too closely, and the free person would vanish into the machinery of bondage, their protests ignored, their freedom papers destroyed or declared forgeries. Esther May had her freedom papers. She showed them to every person who would listen during the 3-day journey south. But freedom papers meant nothing when the men holding you had already decided what you were worth. On September 7, 1835, Esther May Whitfield, Pearl Greer, and Isaiah Greer were sold at a private auction in Valdosta, Georgia. Esther May brought $400. Pearl, young and healthy, brought $300. Isaiah, just 5 years old, brought $250. They were sold to 3 different buyers. Esther May never saw her children again. The man who bought Esther May was named Cornelius Blackwood. He owned a cotton plantation called Magnolia Grove, about 60 miles southwest of Valdosta, near the Florida border. 800 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 123 enslaved people. Cornelius Blackwood was not the cruelest master in Georgia. He was not the kindest either. He was simply a man who saw human beings as property, as tools to be used until they broke, and then discarded. Esther May was assigned to the fields. It did not matter that she could read and write. It did not matter that she had run a household, kept books, taught children. What mattered was that she had strong arms and a strong back, and cotton did not pick itself. For the first 5 years, Esther May tried to escape. She tried 4 times, to be exact. The first time she made it 15 miles before the dogs found her. 30 lashes. The second time she made it to the Suwannee River before a patrol caught her. 40 lashes. The third time she didn't even make it off the plantation. A fellow enslaved person, desperate for the small privileges betrayal might bring, turned her in before she could run. 50 lashes. The fourth time, in 1840, she made it nearly to Savannah, nearly to the docks, nearly to a ship that might have carried her north to freedom. She was caught on the waterfront by a man who recognized the brand on her arm, the letter B, that Cornelius Blackwood burned into all his property after their first escape attempt. 60 lashes, and something worse. Cornelius Blackwood sold her husband. Thomas Greer had searched for 5 years. He had used every penny he earned, called in every favor he was owed, traveled to every slave market between Georgia and Louisiana, looking for his wife and children. He had finally tracked Esther May to Magnolia Grove. He had been making plans, careful plans, to buy her freedom or steal her back. But someone talked. Someone always talked. And Cornelius Blackwood, upon learning that his troublesome slave had a free husband trying to liberate her, decided to send a message. He contacted a slave trader in New Orleans. Within a month, Thomas Greer had been kidnapped just as his family had been, his freedom papers destroyed, his protests ignored. Esther May heard through the whispered networks that connected plantation to plantation that her husband had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. She never learned which one. She never saw Thomas again. After that, Esther May stopped trying to escape, not because she had given up hope. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She stopped because she realized that every time she tried to run, someone else paid the price. The first time, it was her own back. But the fourth time, it was her husband's entire life. If she tried again, who would suffer next? The old woman who had taken her under her wing during those first terrible months. The young mother who shared her cabin and her food. The children who looked at her with eyes that reminded her too much of Pearl and Isaiah. Esther May made a choice. She would survive. She would endure. She would wait. Freedom would come eventually, whether through death or deliverance. Until then, she would keep her head down and her eyes open. 25 years passed, a quarter century of cotton and sweat and pain. Esther May watched the seasons change, watched the crops grow and fail and grow again. She watched Cornelius Blackwood grow old and die in 1852, watched his son, Marcus Blackwood, take over the plantation. Marcus was worse than his father. Where Cornelius had been cold, Marcus was cruel. Where Cornelius had seen his slaves as property, Marcus seemed to see them as something less than human, creatures put on earth specifically for his amusement and abuse. The whippings increased. The food decreased. The work hours stretched from sunrise to well past sunset. Esther May was 50 years old when Marcus Blackwood took over. Her back was scarred. Her hands were calloused. Her hair, once black and thick, had gone completely gray. But she survived. She always survived. Then came the war. Esther May heard about Fort Sumter from a house slave who had overheard the Blackwoods discussing it at dinner, April 1861. The Confederacy had fired on the federal fort in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln was calling for troops. War had begun. For the next 4 years, Esther May listened. She listened to every whisper, every rumor, every scrap of news that filtered down to the slave quarters. She heard about Bull Run and Antietam, about Shiloh and Gettysburg. She heard about the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, though it meant nothing on Magnolia Grove, where the overseer simply laughed when someone mentioned it. She heard about Sherman's march to the sea in late 1864, about the destruction spreading across Georgia like holy fire. And she heard, on that April morning in 1865, that the war was over. Lee had surrendered. The Confederacy was finished. She was free. Marcus Blackwood did not tell his slaves they were free. He had no intention of telling them. As far as he was concerned, the war was a temporary setback, and things would return to normal soon enough. But the Union soldiers who arrived at Magnolia Grove on April 14, 1865, had other ideas. There were about 24 of them, a scouting party from Sherman's forces, their blue uniforms dusty and their faces hard. They rode up to the main house, demanded to speak to the owner, and informed Marcus Blackwood in no uncertain terms that his human property was no longer his to own. Esther May was in the fields when freedom came. She was 62 years old, bent from decades of labor, her body a map of suffering. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, rode out to where she was working and told her she was free. Just like that. "You're free now, ma'am. You can go wherever you like." She fell to her knees and wept. The soldier, clearly uncomfortable with such raw emotion, handed her a piece of paper. It was a document from the Freedmen's Bureau, explaining her rights as a newly freed person. Esther May read it 3 times, unable to believe the words she was seeing. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her dress, and stood up. She was going home. But first she had questions. Questions that had haunted her for 30 years. What happened to Pearl? What happened to Isaiah? And what happened to the people she had left behind in Freeman's Settlement, the community that had been her entire world before it was stolen from her? The young soldier who had delivered her freedom was named Samuel Harding, from a small town in Massachusetts. He was kind, far kinder than he needed to be to an old woman he didn't know. When Esther May explained where she needed to go, he arranged for her to travel with a supply wagon heading north toward Savannah. From there, she would have to make her own way to Ridgewood and Freeman's Settlement. "It's probably not the same as you remember," Samuel warned her. "A lot has changed in 30 years. Esther May knew that. She knew that better than anyone. But she had to see for herself. She had to know. The journey from Magnolia Grove to Ridgewood took nearly 3 weeks. The roads were chaos, filled with refugees and soldiers and newly freed people trying to figure out what freedom even meant. Esther May walked when she had to, rode when she could, slept wherever she found shelter. She was 62 years old, and her body screamed at her with every step. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Home was calling her, and she had been away far too long. She reached Ridgewood on May 5th, 1865. The town itself had changed, grown larger and more prosperous during the decades of her absence. But she was not interested in Ridgewood. She was interested in what lay beyond it. The small community where she had been born, where she had married, where she had raised her children before they were stolen from her. Freeman's settlement should have been about 2 miles north of town, following the old creek road. Esther May remembered every turn, every landmark, every tree along that path. She had walked it 1,000 times in her dreams during those 30 years of bondage. But as she walked that road now, something was wrong. The trees were different, the landmarks were gone, and where Freeman's settlement should have been, there was nothing. Nothing but cotton fields stretching as far as she could see. She stopped a man on the road, a black man about her age, and asked him what had happened to Freeman's settlement. The man looked at her with confusion, then with something that might have been pity. "Freeman's settlement," he repeated. "That's been gone for years, ma'am. 30 years at least. The white folks burned it out back in 35. Said the free coloreds were causing trouble, helping runaways and such. They drove everyone out, killed a few, sold the rest into slavery. Ain't nothing left now but fields." Esther May felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Burned out, driven away, killed, sold into slavery. Her entire community destroyed in the same attack that had taken her and her children. She had always assumed that some of them had escaped, that some part of her home had survived. But there was nothing but cotton growing where her people used to live. The man, whose name was Benjamin, took pity on her. He could see that she was old and exhausted, and that whatever news he had just delivered had broken something inside her. He offered to take her to his home, to give her a place to rest and a meal to eat. His wife Clara was a good woman. She would help. Esther May accepted. She did not know what else to do. Benjamin's home was a small cabin about a mile from where Freeman's settlement used to be. He and Clara were former slaves themselves, freed just weeks ago when the Union soldiers came through. They were trying to build a life on a small plot of land that no one seemed to own anymore, growing vegetables and hoping for the best. Over dinner that night, Esther May told them her story, the kidnapping, the auction, the 30 years at Magnolia Grove, the children she had lost. By the time she finished, Clara was crying, and Benjamin was staring at his plate with the expression of a man who had heard too many stories like this one. "There's something you should know," Benjamin said slowly, not meeting Esther May's eyes. "Something about this land, about who owns it now." Esther May looked at him. "What do you mean?" "After Freeman's settlement was burned out," Benjamin explained, "the land was divided up and sold. Most of it went to a man named Jeremiah Cotton. He's the biggest landowner in the county now, owns about 2,000 acres, all of it worked by slaves until last month. His plantation house is about 3 miles east of here." Esther May nodded. She did not see what this had to do with her. Then Benjamin said something that made her blood turn to ice. "The thing is, ma'am," Benjamin continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "Jeremiah Cotton didn't buy that land himself. He was too young back then, just a boy. His mother bought it. And his mother, well, his mother was a woman from Freeman's settlement. A free-colored woman who somehow didn't get burned out or sold with the rest." Esther May could not breathe. "What was her name?" she asked. "This woman. What was her name?" Benjamin looked at her with those pitying eyes again. Her name was Ruth, he said. Ruth Whitfield. The world went dark around the edges. Ruth Whitfield, her mother. Her mother, who should have been 55 years old when Freeman's settlement was destroyed. Her mother, who should have been taken in the attack just like everyone else. Her mother, who was apparently not taken at all, but had somehow survived, somehow thrived, somehow ended up owning the very land where her daughter's community once stood. But that was impossible. Ruth Whitfield had died in 1832, 3 years before the attack on Freeman's settlement. Esther May had been at her funeral. She had helped dig the grave. "You must be mistaken," Esther May said, her voice shaking. "Ruth Whitfield is dead. She's been dead for 33 years. Benjamin shook his head slowly. "I don't know about that, ma'am. All I know is what folks around here say. The woman who bought that land, who married a white man named William Cotton, and had a son named Jeremiah, she called herself Ruth Whitfield. And she came from Freeman's settlement." Esther May sat in silence for a long time. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Ruth Whitfield was dead. She knew that. She was certain of that. But someone claiming to be Ruth Whitfield had survived the attack on Freeman's settlement, had acquired land, had married a white man, had built a dynasty on the ashes of everything Esther May had lost. Who, and how, and why? There was only one way to find out. She had to go to the cotton plantation. She had to see this woman or whoever had taken her mother's name. She had to understand. "I need to go there," Esther May said. "To the cotton place. I need to see this for myself." Benjamin and Clara exchanged worried looks. "Ma'am," Benjamin said carefully, "that might not be a good idea. Jeremiah Cotton is not a kind man. He didn't take well to losing his slaves. Word is he's been threatening anyone who sets foot on his property." "I don't care," Esther May said. "I've survived 30 years of slavery. I've lost my husband, my children, my home, my entire community. I have nothing left to fear. I need to know the truth." She set out the next morning, walking east along the dirt roads that wound through the Georgia countryside. The cotton plantation was exactly where Benjamin had said it would be, about 3 miles from his cabin. As Esther May approached, she could see the big house rising up from the cotton fields, a white-columned mansion that looked like something out of a picture book. It was beautiful in the way that terrible things can sometimes be beautiful, built on stolen land and stolen labor, a monument to cruelty dressed up in fine architecture. She walked up the long drive toward the main house. Field workers, mostly black, stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Some of them looked confused, others looked worried. A few looked like they wanted to warn her away but didn't dare speak. Esther May kept walking. She climbed the steps to the front porch and knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and a white man appeared. He was about 40 years old, with cold blue eyes and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of contempt. He looked Esther May up and down, taking in her worn clothes, her gray hair, her stooped posture. "What do you want?" he demanded. His voice was sharp, impatient, the voice of a man who was not used to being approached by people like her. "I'm looking for Ruth Whitfield," Esther May said. "I was told she lives here." The man's expression changed. Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been surprise or fear or both. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why are you asking about her?" "My name is Esther May Whitfield," she said. "Ruth Whitfield was my mother, and she died 33 years ago. So I want to know who's been using her name." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come inside," he said. "There's someone you need to meet." The inside of the cotton plantation house was everything the outside promised. Fine furniture, expensive paintings, crystal chandeliers. Esther May walked through rooms that were worth more than everything she had ever owned in her entire life. following the man who had introduced himself as Jeremiah Cotton. He led her to a parlor at the back of the house, where a woman sat in a chair by the window. The woman was old, very old. Her hair was white, her skin was paper-thin, and her hands trembled as they rested on her lap. But her eyes were sharp and clear, and when she looked up at Esther May, those eyes filled with something that might have been recognition. "Mother," Jeremiah said, "there's someone here to see you." The old woman looked at Esther May. Esther May looked at the old woman. And in that moment, Esther May felt the world shift beneath her feet for the second time in 2 days. Because she knew that face. She knew those eyes. She had grown up seeing them every day, had loved them, had trusted them, had believed in them with all her heart. But the face did not belong to Ruth Whitfield. The face belonged to someone else entirely. Someone Esther May had never expected to see again. Someone who should have been sold alongside her on that terrible day in September 1835. The old woman smiled. It was a cold smile, a calculating smile, a smile that held 30 years of secrets. "Hello, Esther May," the woman said. "It's been a long time." And Esther May, standing in the parlor of a plantation built on stolen land and stolen lives, finally understood. She finally understood everything. The woman in the chair was not her mother. The woman in the chair was her sister. Her younger sister, Naomi, who had been 17 years old when Freeman's settlement was attacked. Naomi, who Esther May had assumed was either killed or sold into slavery along with everyone else. Naomi, who had apparently survived. More than survived. Naomi had thrived. She had taken their mother's name. She had married a white man. She had built an empire on the ashes of her own people. And suddenly, terribly, Esther May understood something else. She understood who had betrayed Freeman's settlement in the first place. She understood who had told those men where to find them, when to attack, who to target. She understood why Naomi had survived when everyone else had been killed or sold. Because Naomi had made a deal. Naomi had sold her own people for her own freedom, and Esther May, her own sister, had been part of the price. "You," Esther May whispered. "It was you." Naomi's smile did not waver. She looked at her sister with those sharp, cold eyes, and she said the words that would haunt Esther May for the rest of her life. "Sit down," she said. "We have much to discuss." Esther May did not sit down. She could not sit down. Her legs had turned to stone, her blood had turned to ice, and every breath she took felt like swallowing broken glass. She stood in the middle of that fine parlor, surrounded by wealth that had been built on betrayal, and she stared at the woman who had once been her baby sister. Naomi Whitfield had been 17 years old in 1835. The youngest of 3 children, the baby of the family, the one everyone protected and spoiled and loved. She had been beautiful back then, with their mother's high cheekbones and their father's quick smile. She had been clever, too, clever in ways that Esther May had admired but never fully understood. Now she was 80 years old, withered and white-haired, but those clever eyes had not changed. They still held that same calculating intelligence, that same cold assessment of everyone and everything around her. "I said sit down," Naomi repeated. Her voice was stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "You look like you're about to fall over, and I don't want you dying on my floor before I've had a chance to explain." "Explain?" Esther May's voice cracked on the word. "Explain? You sold us, Naomi. You sold your own family. You sold your own people. What could you possibly explain?" Naomi sighed, the sigh of someone who had been waiting a long time for this conversation and was tired of waiting. "I did what I had to do to survive," she said simply, "just like you did. Just like everyone does. The only difference is that I was better at it." Jeremiah Cotton, who had been standing by the door watching this exchange with growing unease, stepped forward. "Mother," he said, his voice uncertain. What is she talking about? What does she mean you sold your own family? Naomi waved a dismissive hand. Not now, Jeremiah. This is between me and my sister. Go check on the fields or something. Make yourself useful, sister. Jeremiah's face went pale. You told me your family was dead. You told me you were the only survivor of that settlement. I told you what you needed to hear, Naomi said sharply. Now leave us. This doesn't concern you. Jeremiah looked like he wanted to argue, but something in his mother's eyes stopped him. He glanced at Esther May, then back at Naomi, then turned and left the room without another word. Esther May heard his footsteps retreating down the hall, heard a door slam somewhere in the distance. Then there was silence. Naomi gestured to a chair across from her. Now will you sit? My neck hurts from looking up at you. Esther May did not move. Tell me what happened, she said. Tell me everything. Naomi was quiet for a moment, studying her sister's face. Then she nodded slowly. All right, she said. I suppose you've earned that much. But don't interrupt me. This is a long story, and I don't have the patience to tell it twice. She settled back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window, to the cotton fields stretching out beyond the glass. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was softer now, almost dreamy, like she was talking about something that had happened to someone else a long time ago. It started in the summer of 1835, Naomi began, a few months before the attack. I was 17, and I was in love. His name was William Cotton. He was the son of one of the wealthiest planters in the county. White, of course, handsome as sin. And he wanted me. Esther May felt her stomach turn. She remembered William Cotton. She remembered him as a young man with cruel eyes and a crueler smile. The kind of man who looked at black women like they were objects to be used and discarded. He had come to Freeman's settlement a few times, supposedly to buy furniture from Thomas, but Esther May had always felt uneasy around him. We met in secret, Naomi continued. For months. He told me he loved me. He told me he would marry me. He told me he would take me away from Freeman's settlement and give me the life I deserved. And I believed him. I believed every word. Her voice hardened. But then I found out the truth. William didn't want to marry me. He couldn't marry me, not legally, not in Georgia. What he wanted was something else entirely. He wanted me to be his kept woman, his mistress, hidden away on some back corner of his father's property where no one would see. And when I said no, when I told him I wanted more than that, he got angry. Naomi turned to look at Esther May, and for the first time, there was something like pain in her eyes. He told me that if I didn't agree to his terms, he would destroy everything I loved. He would burn Freeman's settlement to the ground. He would sell every person in it, including my own family, and he had the power to do it. His father had connections with the slave catchers, with the local militia, with everyone who mattered in that county. Esther May's hands were shaking. So you agreed, she said. You agreed to help him destroy us. I agreed to survive, Naomi snapped. What would you have done? Let him burn us all anyway. At least this way I had some control. At least this way, I could save myself. Save yourself? Esther May's voice rose. You didn't just save yourself, Naomi. You profited. You got rich. You built all of this on our bones. Naomi did not flinch. Yes, she said simply. I did. The silence that followed was deafening. Esther May could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the rage building inside her like a fire that wanted to consume everything in its path. But she forced herself to stay still, to keep listening. She needed to know all of it. Every terrible detail. What happened that night? Esther May asked. The night they came for us. Tell me exactly what happened. Naomi's gaze returned to the window. It was September 3rd, she said. I remember because there was a full moon. William had given me instructions. I was supposed to unlock the back gate of the settlement, the one that led to the creek road. I was supposed to make sure no one was watching, and I was supposed to stay hidden until it was over. She paused, her jaw tightening. I did everything he asked. I unlocked the gate. I hid in the root cellar behind Solomon's Forge, and I listened while they burned everything. I listened to the screaming, the gunshots, the sound of our people being dragged from their homes. I listened, and I did nothing. Esther May closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she could see it all. The flames, the chaos, the terror on her children's faces as they were torn from her arms. 30 years, and the memory was still as sharp as a knife. "What about Mama and Papa?" Esther May asked. "What happened to them?" Naomi was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Papa tried to fight," she said. "He grabbed his hammer and went after one of the men. They shot him in the chest. He died before he hit the ground. And Mama saw him fall. She ran to him, tried to hold him, tried to stop the bleeding. One of the men hit her with the butt of his rifle. She never got up again." Esther May felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. "So they died," she said. "Our parents died, and you just hid in a cellar and let it happen." "What was I supposed to do?" Naomi demanded. "Die with them? What good would that have done?" "You could have warned us," Esther May said. "You could have told us what was coming. We could have run. We could have fought. We could have done something. And then William would have killed me too," Naomi said flatly. "He made that very clear. If I breathed a word to anyone, I would burn with the rest of you. I believed him. I still believe him." Esther May opened her eyes and looked at her sister. She saw an old woman, frail and withered, clinging to justifications that had kept her conscience quiet for 30 years. She saw a survivor, yes, but she also saw a monster. "What happened after?" Esther May asked. "After the attack? How did you end up here?" Naomi shifted in her chair, wincing slightly as if the movement caused her pain. "William kept his promise," she said. "He hid me on his family's property for a few months until the attention died down. Then he married me. Quietly, secretly, in a ceremony that no court in Georgia would have recognized. But it was enough for him. It was enough for me." "How?" Esther May demanded. "How could you marry the man who murdered our parents, who sold our people into slavery?" "Because he had power," Naomi said simply. "And power was the only thing that mattered. Power was the only thing that could keep me safe." She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly intense. "Do you think I enjoyed it?" she asked. "Do you think I loved him? I hated William Cotton with every fiber of my being. Every night I spent in his bed, I wanted to kill him. But I endured it. I endured it because the alternative was worse. The alternative was being free," Esther May said bitterly. "The alternative was being human." Naomi laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Free. Human. Those are pretty words, Esther May, but they don't mean anything when you're a black woman in Georgia. I saw what happened to free black people. I saw what happened to our community. Freedom was an illusion. The only real protection was power, and the only way to get power was to take it from the people who had it. So you took it," Esther May said. "You took everything." "I took what I could," Naomi agreed. "When William's father died in 1840, William inherited everything. And when William died in 1852, I inherited it from him. The land, the money, the slaves, all of it. And I used it to build something that would last." She gestured around the room at the fine furniture and expensive paintings. "This is my legacy," she said. "This is what I built from nothing. From the ashes of Freeman's settlement, I built an empire. An empire built on slavery," Esther May said. "An empire built on the suffering of your own people." "Everyone's empire is built on suffering," Naomi said. "The only question is whose suffering you're willing to tolerate." Esther May stared at her sister for a long moment. Then she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since she walked through that door. "What happened to my children, Naomi? What happened to Pearl and Isaiah?" Naomi's expression flickered. Something crossed her face, something that might have been guilt or might have been fear. "I don't know," she said. "They were sold at auction in Valdosta. I wasn't there. I don't know who bought them." "You're lying," Esther May said. She could feel it, the same instinct that had failed her 30 years ago but was screaming at her now. "You know something. Tell me." Naomi was silent. Her hands resting on her lap had begun to tremble. "Tell me," Esther May repeated. Her voice was steel now, cold and hard. "Tell me what happened to my children, or I swear to God, Naomi, I will burn this house down around you." Naomi looked at her sister. For the first time since Esther May had entered the room, she looked afraid. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll tell you. But you won't like it." She took a deep breath. "Pearl was sold to a man named Henderson," she said. "A planter from South Carolina. I heard she died of fever about 10 years later. She would have been 18. Esther May felt something crack inside her chest. Pearl, her firstborn, her daughter, dead at 18, alone and enslaved, far from everyone who loved her. "And Isaiah?" Esther May whispered. Naomi's face twisted. "Isaiah," she repeated. "Isaiah was different." "What do you mean, different?" "The buyer who purchased Isaiah at that auction," Naomi said slowly. "It was William Cotton. He bought your son." The room tilted. Esther May grabbed the back of a chair to keep from falling. "What?" "William thought it would be amusing," Naomi said. "A cruel joke. He brought Isaiah here, to this plantation, and he raised him as a house slave. He made Isaiah serve him at dinner, dress him in the morning, attend to his every need. And he made sure Isaiah knew who he really was. He told him about Freeman Settlement, about his family, about everything. He used it to torture him." Esther May could not breathe. She could not think. Her son, her Isaiah, had been here, on this very plantation, serving the man who had destroyed their lives. And Naomi had known. Naomi had let it happen. "Where is he now?" Esther May asked. Her voice was barely audible. "Where is Isaiah?" Naomi would not meet her eyes. "He's dead," she said. "He died in 1858. He was 28 years old." "How?" Naomi was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "He tried to run. William caught him, and William made an example of him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Esther May stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but absorb the horror of what she was hearing. Her son had been here. Her son had suffered here. Her son had died here. And her own sister had watched it happen. "You knew," Esther May finally said. "You knew my son was here. You knew he was being tortured. And you did nothing. What could I have done?" Naomi demanded. "William was my husband. He owned everything, including me. If I had tried to help Isaiah, William would have killed us both." "You could have told me," Esther May said. "When you came to visit me in prison, you could have told me my son was alive. You could have given me that much." Naomi blinked. "Prison? What prison? I never visited you in prison." Esther May stared at her. "But then who?" she began, and stopped. The pieces were falling into place now, terrible pieces of a terrible puzzle. Naomi had never visited her. Naomi had never known where she was. Because Naomi had assumed, just like everyone else, that Esther May had been sold to some distant plantation where she would work until she died. Naomi had never expected her to survive. Naomi had never expected her to come back. "You thought I was dead," Esther May said slowly. "All these years, you thought I was dead." "I thought you were gone," Naomi corrected. "I didn't think about it much, to be honest. I had other things to worry about. Other things." Esther May wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. She wanted to wrap her hands around her sister's throat and squeeze until those clever eyes went dark. But she did none of those things. Instead, she asked one more question. Why did you take Mama's name? Naomi almost smiled. Because Ruth Whitfield was a free woman of color, she said. Her papers were in order. Her history was clean. When William and I needed to create a new identity for me, someone who could legally own property and conduct business, Ruth Whitfield was perfect. No one knew she was dead. No one asked too many questions. You erased her, Esther May said. You stole her name and erased everything she was. I honored her, Naomi said. I gave her name power. I made it mean something. You made it mean nothing, Esther May said. You turned our mother's name into a lie. Everything is a lie, Naomi said. The only question is, which lies help you survive? Esther May looked at her sister for a long moment. She saw an old woman, yes, a frail woman, a dying woman, from the look of her. But she also saw something else. She saw the 17-year-old girl who had unlocked that gate. She saw the woman who had married her parents' murderer. She saw the monster who had watched her nephew suffer and die without lifting a finger to help. And she saw something that Naomi probably didn't even see in herself. She saw fear. Naomi had spent 30 years building walls around herself, accumulating power and wealth and protection, but underneath all of it, she was still terrified, still running from the night she had betrayed everyone who loved her. You're dying, Esther May said. It wasn't a question. She could see it in Naomi's face, in the yellow tinge of her skin, in the way she held herself like every movement was painful. Naomi nodded slowly. Liver, she said. The doctor gives me a few months. Maybe less. Good, Esther May said. The word hung in the air between them. Naomi's eyes widened slightly, but she did not protest. Perhaps she knew she deserved it. Perhaps she was too tired to argue. I'm not going to forgive you, Esther May continued. I want you to understand that. Whatever happens next, whatever you say, I will never forgive you for what you did. Not to me, not to Pearl and Isaiah, not to our parents, not to our people. I never asked for forgiveness, Naomi said. I never wanted it. I know, Esther May said. That's the saddest part. You don't even understand what you lost. She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Naomi's voice, weaker now, almost pleading. What are you going to do? Esther May stopped but did not turn around. I'm going to live, she said, something you never learned how to do. She walked out of the parlor, out of the house, out into the Georgia sunshine. The cotton fields stretched out around her, endless rows of white bowls that would soon be picked by the same hands that had picked them for generations. But something had changed. The people in those fields were free now. Free to leave, free to stay, free to build something new on the ruins of the old. Esther May walked down the long drive, away from the cotton plantation, away from the sister who had stolen everything from her. She did not know where she was going. She did not know what she would do next. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to let Naomi's betrayal define her. She had lost her husband, her children, her parents, her community, 30 years of her life. She had lost everything. But she was still standing. She was still breathing. She was still alive. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Esther May's life. She returned to Benjamin and Clara's cabin, where they welcomed her without question. She told them what she had learned, the truth about Naomi, the truth about Freeman's settlement, the truth about everything. They listened in horror, then in anger.